After the crushing defeat of Litorius at Toulouse in 439, Attila's dealings with the Western Empire slipped into obscurity. One thing is clear. After the massacre of Litorius's Hun troops, Attila sent no further reinforcements to Aetius. Without this crucial support, the Roman landlords of Gaul suffered several setbacks. Their chief enemies remained the same as in the previous decade: the Burgundians, the Visigoths, and the rebellious Bagaudae of Armorica, and each continued to absorb Aetius's attention throughout the 440s. He settled the shattered remnants of the Burgundians in Savoy in 443, though the broader consequences of this act are lost to us. Far less clear, but far more significant for Attila's later designs, were the roles played by the Visigoths and the Bagaudae on the eve of his western campaigns. Back in 433, Aetius had fled to the Huns to escape assassination plots by Empress Placidia and by Sebastian, the son-in-law of Boniface. Sebastian's fortunes fluctuated, but his hostility to Aetius never waned. By 440, we find him a guest at the court of the Visigothic king Theodoric, even leading forces that seized Barcelona. Such support makes plain that Theodoric's enmity toward Aetius survived even after the Treaty of 439. It persisted into the mid-440s, when Gothic forces aided the Suevi in raiding Spain, something that could not have happened without Theodoric's blessing. This alliance was sealed in 449 when the Suevian king Reciarius married Theodoric's daughter. The devastation of Spain in these years can therefore be laid, at least in part, at the door of Visigothic policy. The hostility between Aetius and Theodoric remained a defining feature of Western politics on the eve of Attila's intervention. The Bagaudae, though beaten by Litorius's Huns in 437, remained a constant thorn in the empire's side. Economic oppression and social breakdown kept their rebellion alive. Spain was torn by the struggle between imperial forces and peasant insurgents, while in Gaul, the movement revived again within a few years. In 442, Aetius had settled Alans near Orleans to keep watch over Armorica, and soon gave them license to attack the rebels under their king Gore. The Alans were stopped only by the intervention of Bishop Germanus of Auxerre. The Bagaudae were once again led by Tibato, who had survived his earlier defeat and captivity. His fate in this renewed struggle remains uncertain, but it likely ended badly for him. A more striking episode is preserved in a Gallic chronicle, which tells of Eudoxius, a physician by profession, who joined the Bagaudae. Though well-educated and privileged, he was accused of betrayal and fled to the Huns. His case shows that the rebels attracted not only peasants, but also men of higher standing, confirming reports that the movement drew in people of wealth, education, and noble birth who had lost faith in the imperial system. Thus, by the late 440s, Aetius faced persistent enemies in both the Visigoths and the Bagaudae. Yet his relations with Attila seemed outwardly secure, at least until the matter of Eudoxius. Before the Roman embassy of Maximinus in 449, Aetius had even sent an Italian named Constantius to Attila to act as his Latin secretary. This was not unusual. Aetius had long dispatched such men, both as gestures of goodwill and as a means of gathering intelligence on Hun intentions. An earlier secretary, also named Constantius, had been executed by crucifixion on suspicion of treachery sometime before 445. After Bleda's death, Aetius and Attila still maintained friendly ties, symbolized by the dispatch of another Constantius and the curious gift of Bleda's dwarf, Zirco, Attila was even granted the Roman title of Master of the Soldiers in the Western Empire, not to give him real command of legions, but to provide him with subsidies in grain and pay, a practice often extended to foreign rulers. By 449, however, the alliance was strained. Priscus later encountered West Roman envoys at Attila's camp, whose purpose was to soothe tensions and restore good relations. The dispute centered on an old grievance. During the campaign of 441, as Sirmium faced capture, Constantius had taken gold plate from the city's bishop on the promise that it would be used either to ransom him if taken captive, or to redeem townsfolk if he were slain. When the city fell and its inhabitants were enslaved, Constantius betrayed that trust, pawning the vessels in Rome with a banker named Silvanus. Later, when Bleda and Attila suspected Constantius of other treasons, they executed him. But once Attila learned of the fate of the gold, he demanded that Silvanus be handed over for receiving stolen property that rightly belonged to him. It was to deliver Rome's response to this demand that Romulus and the other ambassadors journeyed to Attila in 449. They carried instructions from both Aetius and the Emperor Valentinian III, though Priscus pointedly named the patrician before the emperor. Their message was that Silvanus had lent money to Constantius in good faith, taking the plate as security without knowing it was stolen. He had since sold it to priests, for it was deemed impious to use consecrated vessels for private gain. If Attila refused to drop his claim, Silvanus would repay the value in coin. But Rome would not surrender a man guilty of no crime. When Priscus left the Huns' headquarters, the dispute over the Sirmium treasure was still unresolved. In conversation with Romulus and the other envoys, he learned that Attila remained firm. Unless Silvanus was surrendered, war would follow. How this affair ended, no record tells us. It may have been little more than a maneuver to reclaim the gold, but it also carried the potential to grow into a long series of petty demands, much like those the Eastern Empire had endured after its earlier treaties with the Huns. By the spring of 450, the situation stood as follows. Attila had secured his eastern frontier through the Third Treaty with the Eastern Romans. With Theodosius still relatively young, there was no expectation of renewed conflict along the Danube. In the west, Aetius remained hostile toward both the Visigoths under Theodoric and the rebellious Bagudai, but Attila had not entered into direct dealings with the Visigoths since the foundation of their kingdom at Toulouse. His relationship with Aetius and the Western court was complicated. He had long been their ally, yet the matter of Silvanus introduced a new tension. This could have been resolved easily enough if it wasn't intended as a pretext for future demands. More troubling for Aetius was that Eudoxius, once denounced in Gaul, had found refuge with the Huns. Should Attila choose to support the Bagaudae, the estates of the Roman aristocracy in Gaul could change hands overnight. What Aetius thought of this possibility remains unknown. From the vantage point of spring 450, few observers could have predicted Attila's true intentions for the following year. Yet it may be that his designs were already clear to some at the time. With hindsight, knowing that he invaded Gaul in 451 and Italy in 452, we can see why he dealt so generously with Anatolius and Nomus in their negotiations. He wanted peace in the east while he struck in the west. Early that year, he even spread word that his target would be the Visigothic kingdom in Gaul, and that he would march as an ally of Valentinian's court in Ravenna. Even if Attila announced such an alliance, it does not prove that the matter of Silvanus had been settled. If that grievance remained unresolved, It would have discouraged Aetius and Valentinian from opposing whatever Attila planned to do in Gaul. The deeper question is when he made the decision to march west at all. Shortly before spring 450, Gaiseric in North Africa had urged him to strike at the Visigoths. Yet the notion was not new. Attila seems to have contemplated it long before the Vandal king encouraged him. Why he turned his attention to Gaul remains uncertain, for no surviving source explains it. The eastern provinces still offered ample wealth to extort, and the flow of tribute from Constantinople had not dried up. Even if the Balkans were stripped of plunder, tribute meant more to the Huns than mere raiding, and the imperial treasury still held vast reserves. Marcian, who succeeded Theodosius, left 100,000 pounds of gold untouched at his death 6 years later. Attila, however, could not have foreseen that Theodosius would die only a few months after he resolved to turn his armies towards the west. Nothing suggests that in the early months of 450, Attila had already envisioned a campaign against the Western Empire in its entirety. His immediate objective was the Visigothic kingdom at Toulouse, and its destruction promised advantages for the Roman landowning class in Gaul. When Attila declared that he was marching as the ally of Valentinian and guardian of Roman friendship, there was little reason to doubt his sincerity. Yet alliance with Valentinian did not necessarily extend to Aetius. Sources hint that Attila's plans could only move forward if Aetius were removed from power. Perhaps Attila initially hoped to replace Aetius as the West's military champion, turning his honorary position as master of soldiers into a reality. If the Western government had accepted him in that role, Attila could have controlled Rome's western provinces from within. But his precise motives remain uncertain, since the surviving material does not allow us to reconstruct them fully. It is difficult to believe that the Huns marched simply to serve Valentinian or to please Gaiseric in Africa. The Huns did not risk their position in Europe for the sake of others. Their deeper reason for action can only be guessed. After deciding to strike the Visigoths, Attila reassured Valentinian that he bore no hostility toward the Western Romans, though he said nothing of Aetius, and at the same time urged Theodoric to renounce the uneasy treaty concluded a decade earlier. It was at this moment that the famous scandal of Justa Grata Honoria erupted. Honoria, sister of Valentinian, lived in Ravenna with her own household, managed by a steward named Eugenius. In 449, she began an affair with him, and rumors spread that she became pregnant. Once the intrigue was uncovered, Eugenius was executed, and Honoria was forced into marriage with Herculanus, a wealthy senator of unshakable loyalty. Furious at her fate, Honoria hatched a desperate plan. In the spring of 450, she sent her eunuch, Hyacinth, to Attila with money and her ring, begging him to rescue her from her marriage. Her motives were political from the beginning. First, she had sought to place Eugenius on the throne with herself as empress, and now she offered to make herself Attila's consort, ruling alongside him in Gaul, if not in Ravenna itself. News of this reached Valentinian quickly. Hyacinth was arrested, and, under torture, confessed everything before being executed. Theodosius advised Valentinian to hand Honoria over to Attila to avoid trouble, but the emperor chose otherwise. At the request of her mother, Placidia, who herself had once married the Gothic king Athalf, Honoria was placed in her custody. Her later fate is unknown. Attila, however, seized on her appeal, at once claiming her as his wife and demanding recognition of the union. The summer of 450 brought further developments. Not only did Attila have Honoria's ring, but he also learned that Theodosius was dead and that Marcian had become emperor of the East. One of Marcian's first actions was the execution of Chrysaphius, the eunuch minister who had championed tribute payments to the Huns. Marcian made it plain that no more gold would be sent. In response, Attila sent embassies both west and east. To Ravenna he demanded that Honoria suffer no harm, for she was his bride, and that he be granted half of the Western Empire as her inheritance. The response was sharp. Honoria could not marry him because she was already engaged, and imperial succession came through the male line, not the female. To Constantinople, he sent a demand for the resumption of tribute. Marcian's government was even firmer than Valentinian's. No tribute would be paid. Gifts might be offered in peace, but if Attila sought war, the East would meet him with equal strength. By late 450, another complication arose over the succession among the Ripuarian Franks. The death of their king had led to a quarrel between his sons. The elder turned to Attila, while the younger sought support from Aetius. Priscus, in Rome at the time, saw the young claimant with long golden hair flowing over his shoulders. Aetius adopted him as a son, while Valentinian and his court showered him with gifts. By November, it was clear that Rome in the west was preparing for an open breach with the Huns. Valentinian showed no sign of casting off Aetius, despite Attila's hostility. At this point, Attila faced a choice. He could answer Marcian's defiance by turning east or continue with his plan to attack the Visigoths. Although sources say he hesitated, he resolved to strike west first while his forces were still fresh. Marcian's boldness, though meant to strengthen Rome, nearly destroyed the eastern position in a matter of months. Attila never forgot the emperor's defiance. By the end of 450, Attila's campaign had grown larger than he first intended. What had begun as an attack on the Visigoths at Toulouse now also involved the Franks, for the majority of their people supported the younger son allied with Aetius. Thus, the Franks as a whole became his enemies. Even so, Attila continued to proclaim himself guardian of Roman friendship when entering Gaul, though he must have expected resistance from Ravenna. Gaiseric of the Vandals, skilled as ever in intrigue, certainly encouraged a blow against the Visigoths, though he provided no troops. Attila, therefore, marched out from his wooden halls on the Hungarian plain without foreign allies, relying solely on his own immense confederation of subject peoples. Early in 450, soon after the turn of the year, Attila and his Huns left Pannonia and began their march westward. Contemporary writers, overwhelmed with terror, claimed his host numbered 500,000 warriors, a figure born more of panic than of fact. That same fear echoes in the verse of Sidonius Apollinaris, a Gallic aristocrat with everything to lose should the invasion succeed. He described a torrent of peoples pouring into Gaul: the Rugians, fierce Gepids, Geloni, Burgundians, Siri, Huns, Nuri, Bastarnae, Thuringians, Bructeri, and even the Franks dwelling near the river Neckar. In his dread, Sidonius even conjured up long-vanished tribes such as the Bastarnae and Nuri, and even the imaginary Belenoti, a name borrowed from ancient poetry. Yet hidden within this poetic exaggeration lies a kernel of truth. Sidonius may have accidentally preserved the memory that remnants of the Burgundians east of the Rhine, those who had once resisted Attila's uncle Octor, were now subdued and forced into his ranks. The rest of his catalogue rings truer. Rugians, Gepids, Siri, and Thuringians undoubtedly marched with their Hun overlords. The Ostrogoths, though not mentioned in the poem, were also present, commanded by their king Valamir and his brothers Theodomir and Vidimir. As for the Ripuarian Franks, Attila had initially regarded them as enemies, since Aetius had secured the loyalty of their young claimant to the throne. but Attila could hardly ignore an enemy so close to his line of advance. His first task seems to have been to subdue these Franks, after which he pressed some of their warriors into his army, compelling them to fight alongside the other subject nations. It is quite possible, as some have suggested, that his forces crossed the Rhine near Neuwied, north of Koblenz, building rafts from felled trees on the riverbank. While the march gathered momentum, Attila revived his claim through Honoria. The West had refused to hand her over and had dismissed his demand for half of the empire as baseless. Yet as his troops advanced, he sent a new embassy to Ravenna, producing Honoria's ring as proof of their betrothal and insisting that she had inherited half of the West from her father, only to be cheated of it by her brother Valentinian. The Roman court rejected these claims outright, but Attila pressed on, swelling his army with new levies and subject peoples. Until this point, the Western Romans still clung to the hope that Attila's wrath would fall solely upon the Visigoths. That hope was shattered when he sent a final, uncompromising message. According to the historian John Malalas, a Gothic envoy delivered Attila's command to Valentinian. The emperor was to prepare his palace for his master. A similar message was carried to Constantinople. The tale, confused in names and details, nonetheless preserves the blunt tone of Attila's demand. Whatever its precise form, the threat was enough to jolt Valentinian and Aetius into action. At the last moment they resolved to resist, and, for the first time in decades, to seek alliance with the Visigoths, Aetius's sworn enemies. Meanwhile, the Visigoths had resigned themselves to standing alone. Theodoric, their king, prepared to face Attila's onslaught without Roman aid, declaring that while the Hun boasted of victories, the Goths still knew how to fight with pride. Aetius now faced his greatest diplomatic challenge. He needed not only to persuade Theodoric to bury 20 years of hostility and join forces with the Romans, but also to convince him to fight not merely in defense of his own realm around Toulouse, but for Gaul as a whole. For that, the battle needed to be fought far to the north, near the frontier. Aetius himself could hardly make such an appeal with credibility, but Avitus, who had once brokered peace with the Goths, was dispatched with a letter from Valentinian. Through his efforts, Theodoric agreed to the alliance. Thus, against all expectation, the Roman general and the Visigothic king prepared to stand side by side against Attila, the former ally of Aetius, and now his most dangerous foe. By the time Aetius finally marched out of Italy, the Gallic towns were already ablaze. One chronicler wrote that Attila with his fearsome squadrons had spread across the plains of Belgica, while Aetius came late, leading only a thin force of auxiliaries and no legions. His weakness was partly due to the famine then ravaging Italy, which made it impossible to raise a large army. When at last he joined Theodoric and the Visigoths, likely at the end of April or early May, he moved north with a host drawn from every corner of the West. Jordanes preserves a curious list of the peoples who made up this coalition. Some names, like the Leticiani and Olibriones, are obscure. The Burgundians, settled by Aetius in Savoy after their earlier defeat by his Huns, now marched for him, though their kinsmen east of the Rhine fought under Attila. The Ripuarian Franks, some of whom had escaped Attila's first onslaught, were present, along with contingents of Salian Franks long established within Roman territory. The Sarmatians, perhaps meaning the Alans, fought uneasily in the center, while Saxons from north of the Loire, possibly recognized by Rome as settlers, sent warriors. Most surprising was the presence of the Armoricans, the very peasants who had so often rebelled against imperial landowners. Sidonius claimed it was Avitus who roused them, though the details are uncertain. Attila swept through the cities of Gaul, and on 7th April seized Metz before turning toward Orléans. His move was encouraged by Sanguinus, king of the Alans settled near the Loire, who had promised to betray the city to him. Aetius and Theodoric, warned of the plot, raced to secure Orléans before Attila arrived. They came almost too late. The Huns besieged the city fiercely, and even forced their way inside before the approach of the allies compelled them to withdraw. The citizens endured with the encouragement of Bishop Aignan, and though the details remain unclear, Attila's retreat marked a sharp setback. He pulled back across Champagne to the Catalonian plains, the open ground of modern northeastern France, where his cavalry could maneuver freely. The exact site is unknown, but tradition places it near Morica, not far from Troy. If the siege of Orléans was broken on the 14th of June, the great battle likely followed around the 20th of June. The struggle began in late afternoon, with both armies racing for a commanding hill. Neither side secured the summit, but each held part of its slopes. On the allied right stood the Visigoths, under their aging king Theodoric. Aetius and his Romans held the left. Between them were Sanguinus and his wavering Alans, whose loyalty was always in doubt. Facing them, Attila commanded the center, while his subject nations, Gepids, Ostrogoths, and others, held the wings. The opening clash cost the Huns the hill they had partly occupied. Afterward came what Jordanus described as a fierce, unyielding, and prolonged battle. In the chaos, Theodoric fell, trampled amid the fighting, his body recovered only the next day. As darkness fell, Attila withdrew behind the great wagon circle he had drawn up in advance. Later, storytellers claimed hundreds of thousands were slain, with Jordanes alone giving the astonishing figure of 165,000 on each side, plus 15,000 more in a skirmish between Franks and Gepids on the eve of the main clash. Such numbers are clearly inflated, yet they reflect the horror the battle inspired. A tale spread that the fighting was so savage that the dead themselves carried on the struggle, their ghostly combat ringing in the night air for 3 days and nights. The day after the battle, events in Aetius' camp took a curious turn. The Visigoths, furious at the death of their king Theodoric, wanted to renew the fight and starve Attila out in his wagon fortress. It was said that Attila, convinced he might be overwhelmed, had piled saddles to form a funeral pyre and resolved to burn himself alive rather than fall into enemy hands. But Aetius had no wish to see the Huns annihilated. They had been his allies for much of his career, and their mercenary squadrons had often kept the Visigoths in check. He still hoped, however unlikely it may seem, that the Huns might serve him again in the future. Moreover, the Western Empire, without them, would struggle to balance the growing power of Toulouse. For this reason, he quietly advised Theodoric's son, Thorismund, to return at once and secure his throne before his brothers claimed it. The young king accepted the advice and withdrew with his men. Aetius then spoke with the young Frankish prince whom he had recently befriended. He warned him that if the Franks' main forces were absent, Attila, retreating northwards, might easily establish the elder brother who had appealed to him the year before as king. The young ruler also heeded the counsel and returned home. Thus, Attila was allowed to retreat from Gaul unhindered. It was a calculated duplicity, but Aetius saw no other way to preserve the order he had chosen to defend, and his decision soon proved shrewd. By 451, the Danube frontier was restless again. Marcian, who had succeeded Theodosius in the east, stood firm in his refusal to continue paying tribute. Attila sent envoys demanding submission, but when the ambassador Apollonius arrived with no gold, Only words. The Hun would not even grant him an audience. Attila contemptuously ordered him to hand over his gifts and threatened him with death. But Apollonius replied that if he were killed, the Huns would take spoils, not gifts. Attila let him go, but relations with the Eastern court had collapsed. In September, a small Hunnic force raided eastern Illyricum, a warning of what Marcian could expect if he persisted. The emperor, anxious about his frontier, was forced to shift the great church council from Nicaea to Chalcedon, and even personally rode against the raiders, though whether he defeated them is unknown. When the campaigning season of 452 arrived, however, Attila turned his fury not eastward, but into Italy. His anger at the Western Romans was sharpened by the outcome in Gaul, for he now laid the blame for his failure squarely on them. At the same time, the separation of the Roman and Visigothic armies tempted him to strike where resistance might be weakest. News of his arrival in Italy stunned Aetius, who even considered abandoning the peninsula with the emperor. Attila's first target was Aquileia, a city famed for withstanding sieges throughout its long history. The initial assaults failed, and murmurs spread among the Huns that the campaign should be abandoned. But Attila summoned auxiliaries skilled in siege warfare, likely from among his subject peoples, and their engines eventually breached the defenses. Later generations told a tale that as Attila circled the walls in doubt, he saw storks rise from the rooftops and fly away with their young, a sign that the city's doom was near. Taking the omen, he pressed on until Aquileia was stormed, plundered with merciless cruelty, and left in ruins. So complete was its destruction that a century later men struggled even to locate the place where it had once stood. After their first success, the Huns pressed forward at full speed, and city after city fell in terror before their advance. Concordia and Altinum soon yielded, and with them vanished the peaceful landscapes once praised by Martial, who had written of Altinum's shores rivaling the luxury of Baiae and of Aquileia, resting by the waters of the Timavus. Next came Patavium, birthplace of Livy centuries before. Each of these proud cities was burned to the ground, their people dragged into captivity, too frightened even to attempt resistance. As one account grimly remarked, the Huns reveled their way through the cities of Venetia. Turning westward, they captured Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, and Bergamo, before advancing upon Milan. Both Milan and Ticinum were taken, yet for reasons unknown, they were spared the usual horrors. No massacre of inhabitants, no pillaging of wealth. It was at Milan, so the story goes, that Attila entered the imperial palace and saw a mural depicting the emperors of East and West enthroned, while slain Scythians lay beneath their feet. Furious, he forced a painter to create a new image, Attila enthroned, and before him the two emperors pouring out gold from a sack at his feet. Another tale, also connected with these campaigns, sought to explain why the Hun leader did not march across the Apennines and sack Rome itself as Alaric had done. According to this version, Attila wished at first to march on the ancient capital, but his men warned him that Alaric had died soon after plundering the Eternal City, and urged him not to tempt the same fate. Yet the real reason for Attila's withdrawal had little to do with superstition. Aetius had abandoned his earlier idea of fleeing Italy and resolved instead to sue for peace. An embassy was sent to meet Attila on the banks of the Mincius. It was led by Pope Leo, though why he was chosen remains uncertain, for it is unlikely that Attila feared the admonitions of the Church. With him went Trigetius, a former prefect experienced in delicate negotiations, and Avienus, a wealthy senator whose self-interest was notorious. According to the pious version, it was this embassy that persuaded Attila to withdraw, but other contemporary voices reveal the harsher truth. Italy was gripped by famine and plague. The land through which the Huns marched could no longer feed an army, and the devastation of previous campaigns left nothing to sustain them. Attila's forces, already weakened by losses in Gaul, were too vulnerable to disease to risk pushing deeper into the peninsula. Reports of sickness among the troops had already appeared, and to linger was to invite ruin. Meanwhile, Marcian in the east seized his chance. Offended months earlier by Attila's insults to his envoy Apollonius, he now struck across the Danube. Germanic tribes under Hunnic rule had long groaned under oppression, and with Attila's main army far away, resistance flared. An eastern commander, ironically named Aetius, led the incursion, defeated the Huns left to guard their homeland, and was rewarded with the consulship soon after. Pressed by famine, plague, and the renewed strength of the East Romans, Attila had no choice. He abandoned his campaign without ever crossing south of the Po. The empire he had built upon terror and conquest now trembled at its very foundations. As the year 453 opened, it seemed inevitable that Marcian would face Attila's fury. For 2 years, the Hun ruler had delayed striking at the Eastern Empire while dealing with affairs in the West, but now he announced his intentions clearly. He sent word to Marcian that, since the tribute promised by Theodosius had not been delivered, he would make war on the Eastern Romans and enslave their people. Yet the blow he threatened was never carried out. Before the campaign season began, Attila chose to take another wife. His bride was named Ildico, said to be of Germanic descent and famed for her beauty. The marriage may have had political motives, but nothing certain is known. After the wedding feast, Attila drank heavily late into the night. When the next day passed and he did not emerge from his chamber, his men broke down the door and found him lifeless, with Ildico sitting beside him, veiled and weeping. Attila had bled profusely from the nose in his sleep, something that had troubled him before and, dulled by drink, had suffocated. His body bore no wounds. The Huns were overwhelmed by shock. As a sign of grief, they cut their hair and gashed their faces with swords, declaring that their greatest warrior should not be mourned with tears, but with the blood of men. Attila's body was placed in a silken tent set on the wide plains where he had so often ridden to war. Around him, skilled horsemen galloped wildly in circles, a ritual display meant to gladden the spirit of their fallen lord. A funeral song was sung in his honor, preserved by Jordanes from Priscus's account. Even through multiple translations, its meaning remains vivid. Attila, chief of the Huns, son of Mundioch, lord of the bravest peoples, who with unmatched power held dominion over Scythian and Germanic realms, who terrified both Eastern and Western empires, who captured cities and accepted tribute when prayers for mercy were made. This man did not fall by an enemy's blade, nor through treachery, but died among his own, in peace, happy, and without pain. Who can call such an end death when none deems it worthy of vengeance? When the mourning ended, a burial mound was raised. His body was placed within and covered in layers, first gold, then silver, then iron. It was said the gold and silver symbolized the wealth he had extracted from both empires, while the iron marked his conquests over nations. His weapons, spoils, and precious gems were placed beside him, and those who performed the burial were slain, so the location of his grave would remain secret. One detail of the ceremony has particular interest. The word strava, meaning funeral, survives as the sole known fragment of the Hunnic tongue. Scholars have debated whether it was Germanic, Slavic, or Turkish in origin, but from this single word, no certain judgment can be made. Rumors quickly spread that Attila had not died naturally, but had been slain by his bride Ildiko as he slept. Some chroniclers repeated the tale, and in later traditions of the North, the story was told that she killed him to avenge murdered brothers. Yet most agreed he died as a result of drunken excess and a fatal hemorrhage, and poets in the West mocked the conqueror's end, remarking that a captain should live with sobriety. News of Attila's death spread rapidly through Europe, greeted with relief and joy by all peoples, none more than the Romans. A legend soon arose that Marcian himself had foreknowledge of the event. On the very night of Attila's death, a heavenly figure appeared to the emperor in a dream and showed him the Huns' bow broken apart. Whether invention or belief, the story captured the spirit of the time. For those who had feared him as invincible, the bow of Attila was truly broken, and with his death, the empire he had built began swiftly to unravel. After Attila's death, his sons divided his dominion among themselves, treating the subject nations as though they were a family inheritance. A Gothic observer remarked bitterly that warlike kings with their peoples were portioned out like an estate. No one knows how many sons Attila left behind, but one account insists that through his boundless lust they had become almost a nation in themselves. This was the only known occasion when the Huns divided power in such a way, and it is telling that they cared not for the land itself, but only for the peoples who lived upon it. Even then, it seems they did not intend to break apart entirely, for Attila and Bleda had always acted in concert during their joint rule. Yet the precedent of Oktar showed what was likely to come. Once the brothers settled separately with their followers, rapid and united military action became impossible. It did not take long for quarrels to erupt among them. Some of the brothers sought to deprive others of their share, and the result was a series of battles that weakened their combined power. This internal strife paved the way for rebellion among their subject peoples. The first sparks of revolt appear to have been lit by Ostrogoths living in the valley of the Theiss, where the Huns had settled them long before. The true leader of the rising, however, was Ardaric, king of the Gepids, once Attila's trusted ally. He now inspired the Germanic tribes with what one source calls the uplifting desire for freedom. After several bloody clashes, the decisive battle came, probably in the year 455, on the river Nedao in Pannonia. The Ostrogoths did not fight, preferring to stand aside, which later brought them into bitter conflict with the Gepids. But most of the subject nations joined Ardaric's cause, including large numbers of Shiri, Rugi, Suebi, and Herals. Their victory was overwhelming. Attila's eldest son, Elik, once made governor of the Akatziri, fell in the fighting, and the Huns are said to have lost 30,000 warriors. The survivors fled across the Carpathians to the Black Sea, returning to the very lands where their ancestors had burst into Europe 80 years earlier. Even there, they found no lasting refuge. Some soon drifted back into the Theiss Valley, burning with hatred for the Ostrogoths, whom they blamed for beginning the wars that had broken their power. They struck at Valamir and his followers, calling the Goths deserters and runaway slaves. At first they caught Valamir unprepared, but the attempt ended in another crushing defeat. Only a small band under Ernak, Attila's favored younger son, escaped. With Marcian's permission, they settled at the confluence of the Danube and the Theiss. Others lingered in scattered groups, reduced to raiding bands. Some Huns were settled by the Romans themselves, in depopulated frontier districts. In Dacia Ripensis, two relatives of Attila's line, Emnitsur and Ultzindur, were granted authority over the fortresses of Utus, Oiscus, and Almus. Elsewhere, bands of Huns gave themselves up and were absorbed into Roman provinces, acquiring local names such as Sacramontisi and Fossatici. Not all laid down arms willingly. In the 460s, a war band under a leader named Hormedak swept suddenly into Sardica, capturing the city before its gates could even be closed. Anthemius, son-in-law of Marcian and future emperor of the West, besieged them under harsh conditions, for his men suffered from lack of food and water. Hormedak was also desperate and eventually sallied forth in open battle, hoping to break the siege. At the outset, a Roman cavalry commander defected to the enemy, perhaps himself a Hun. But Anthemius pressed on with his infantry and won the day. Peace was granted only on the condition that the traitor be handed over. From this turbulent generation, we catch glimpses of other figures once tied to Attila's court. Orestes, who had once served in Hun councils, returned to the Western Empire and later raised his own son Romulus to the throne, remembered as the last emperor of the West. Their reign was short, for both were overthrown by Odoacer, the first barbarian king of Italy. Ironically, Odoacer was believed to be the son of Edeko, the Hun noble who had once conspired in the plot to kill Attila. Later traditions name him Idico or Adico, but scholars long agreed he was the same man Priscus had encountered years before. After Attila's death, Edeko himself joined a grand coalition of tribes determined to finish the Ostrogoths once and for all. The hatred between Huns and Goths endured, but fate was not with him. At the river Bolia in Pannonia, the Goths, now led by Theodemer and Vidimer after Valamir's death, crushed the Confederates. Edeko disappears from history after this rout, perhaps falling in battle, while his son Odoacer lived on to carve out a new future in Italy. Among Attila's many children, two sons stand out in the record, Dengizek and Ernak. The latter had once been seen by Priscus during the banquet held in their father's great hall, and in later years he was allowed by Emperor Marcian to settle at the meeting of the Danube and the Theiss. Dengizek at first remained in the Theiss Valley, but when he learned that the Ostrogoths had gone to war against a people known as the Sadagi, he rallied the remnants of the tribes still loyal to him, the Ultzinzurs, Angeshiri, Bitugures, and Bardor. Marching into Pannonia, they reached Bassiana, east of Sirmium, and began laying waste to the countryside. The Ostrogoths fell upon them with such force that the surviving Huns lived in dread of Gothic arms from that day forward. Dengizek vanished from the chronicles for many years after this defeat, but returned to the stage toward the end of the 460s. In 468 or 469, envoys from the sons of Attila appeared in Constantinople, seeking to heal their disputes with the Eastern Empire and reopen the market towns on the frontier. Their mission failed. Emperor Leo saw no reason to extend trade privileges to men who had brought such ruin to Roman lands. Frustration split the brothers. Dengizek pressed for war, while Ernak declined, saying he had troubles enough within his own territories. Dengizek led the campaign alone. He appeared on the Danube, where he was confronted by Anagast, commander of the Roman forces in Thrace, and son of Arnagisclus, who had often fought Attila. When Roman envoys asked Dengizek his demands, he dismissed them with contempt and instead sent his own message directly to Leo, threatening war unless land and gold were given to him and his men. Negotiations collapsed, Dengizek crossed the river, and his final campaign began. The outcome was disaster. Defeated in battle by Anagast, Dengizek was slain, his head carried to Constantinople and paraded down the Mese before being fixed on a pole at the Xylokerkos gate. The city rejoiced, for the sight reassured them that the terror of Hun raids was at last broken. Ernak fades into obscurity after this time. The prophecy that he would restore his father's fallen glory proved false, and some have suggested he ended his life as nothing more than a forgotten mercenary in Roman service. The last known Hun raid in the 5th century struck the Danube frontier in the early reign of Emperor Zeno, but his generals beat it back with ease. Though weakened, the Huns did not disappear entirely. Some took Roman pay and entered imperial armies. Around the time of Dengizek's death, we hear of a Hun named Chelchul, a junior officer serving under the powerful Aspar. During a truce in a campaign against Goths and their Hun allies, Chelchul lured the Gothic leaders into talks. Claiming to love the truth above all else, he told them that Emperor Leo meant to grant land only to the Huns in their ranks, not to the Goths, and reminded them of the ancient hatred between their peoples. The Goths believed him, turned on their Hun comrades, and tried to massacre them. For a time, the scheme pleased Anagast, but the slaughter brought no gain. The Goths and their Hunnic allies soon realized the folly of weakening themselves, and they renewed their alliance to continue fighting the Romans. Chelchul's deception had nearly sown disaster, but in the end, failed. Other bands of Huns found service in the Western Empire. In 457, Emperor Majorian recruited them for his campaigns in Gaul and Africa, but they proved faithless. As his army gathered in Italy, only the Huns mutinied, stirred up by a leader named Tuldala, whose Germanic name suggests he was a Goth among them. The rebellion was crushed, but only after blood had been shed. 2 years later, when Majorian planned to strike at the Vandals in Africa, his ally Marcellinus of Dalmatia landed in Sicily with a force that included Huns. Again, they betrayed their employer, bribed away by Ricimer, the supposed ally of the emperor. Marcellinus was left helpless, and Gaiseric was free to focus his power against Majorian. Treachery and division had marked the Huns in the days of Attila, and in their twilight years they continued to show the same fatal weakness. It remains uncertain whether leaders such as Dengizek and Edeko ever truly believed they could revive the vast empire once commanded by Attila. Whatever dreams they may have held of uniting the Huns into a single confederacy and dominating the steppe collapsed during the turbulent years of the 460s. In those years, the historian Priscus recorded one of the most remarkable episodes in the story of the steppes. He described how ambassadors arrived in Constantinople representing the Saraguri, the Uguri, and the Onaguri. These tribes explained that they had been driven from their homes by the Sabiri, who in turn had been forced into motion by yet another people, a nation now appearing for the first time in the written record: the Avars. The Avars themselves had been pushed onward, according to the reports, by strange disasters striking the lands beyond them. The sea had surged inland, devastating the coasts, while myth told of monstrous griffins sweeping down upon human settlements and devouring all in their path. Whether these tales were believed or not, the chain of displacements was real. Each nation displaced the next, and eventually the Saraguri fell upon the Akatsiri, a people once subdued by Attila, but who had regained their independence after his death. Following a series of battles, the Saraguri conquered them, and then sought an alliance with the Eastern Romans. Their request for friendship was granted, but they were only the first wave of many peoples now surging westward. Barely a dozen years after Attila's death, the steppes were overwhelmed by fresh swarms of fierce nomads. For the scattered Huns, this meant there was no hope of reclaiming the wide pastures that had once supported their empire. Dengizek, Ernak, and their kin were forced to remain within the shadow of Rome, or on its immediate borders. Beyond lay no refuge, only the advancing tide of new and formidable tribes. Some have thought Priscus's reference to the ocean meant that this vast movement had begun far away, perhaps north of the Altai Mountains in eastern Siberia. Others have suggested it started closer, around the Aral Sea. Whatever its origin, the result was clear. The steppes had become crowded with powerful nations, and the Huns, once the terror of Europe, were reduced to a pitiful remnant, surviving only as petty raiders and cattle thieves on the margins of greater powers. The scattered bands of nomads who once roamed the steppe at the close of the 4th century could never have created the vast empire that later stretched across Central Europe had their society remained unchanged. But, as with all peoples, their way of life evolved. As their wealth increased, kingship began to emerge, and over time, the accumulation of riches transformed their world in even deeper ways. Around the year 430, Rua secured a treaty with the Eastern Romans, by which the emperor agreed to pay him a tribute of 350 pounds of gold each year. Just 5 years later, under the leadership of Bleda and Attila, this sum was doubled to 700 pounds annually. After their victories in the Balkans in 443, another treaty raised the payment dramatically. A lump sum of 6,000 pounds of gold was handed over as arrears, and the yearly tribute was trebled to 2,100 pounds. Alongside these payments, the Huns profited greatly from the ransom of Roman captives. Earlier in the century, prisoners were sold for a single gold coin, but by the 440s, the price had risen to 12. Occasionally, individual captives fetched staggering sums, as in the case of a noblewoman seized in Ratiaria, who was ransomed for 500 gold coins. To prevent any loss of revenue, strict measures ensured that no prisoners escaped before their ransom was paid. The gold tribute, however, was delivered directly to the supreme leaders. Under Bleda and Attila, and later under Attila alone, the rulers grew immensely rich while distributing rewards unevenly among their warriors. The most powerful chiefs took a disproportionately large share of plunder when cities fell, and raids into the Roman provinces brought limitless wealth. The invasions of 441 to 443 and 447 in particular flooded Hun society with booty and money. This influx of resources altered the balance of their society profoundly. Bleda and Attila were the sons of Mundiuk, brother to Rua and Oktar, and their joint rule marked the continuation of leadership within a single family. After Bleda's death, Attila ruled alone, and when he died, his empire was divided among his numerous sons as if it were a family estate. Leadership had thus become hereditary. Authority no longer rested solely on personal skill in war, as in earlier times, but increasingly on inherited wealth. An aristocracy had begun to emerge. Priscus describes Attila as an autocratic ruler even in times of peace. He appeared before his people amid their shouts of acclamation, but their loyalty was based on fear. The entire Hun nation lived in awe of him. He consulted no one when making decisions about campaigns or negotiations, not even his closest lieutenants. He judged disputes personally, standing at the door of his wooden hall, issuing quick decisions that were accepted without protest. He commanded absolute power over life and death, a striking contrast with the more limited authority of earlier chiefs. Attila had broken free from the restraints of tribal custom, and no kinship ties or national assemblies could hold him in check. He could kill members of his own family without consequence, and indeed he had slain his own brother. Many of his subjects regarded him as a god, and he encouraged this belief, strengthening his position by claiming possession of the sacred sword of the war god. Through conquest, tribute, and plunder, Attila transformed the Huns from a loose tribal confederacy into a centralized power ruled by the unchallenged will of a single man. Wealth had revolutionized their society and elevated one family into a hereditary dynasty. In Attila's dominion, there was no place for the older class of war leaders who once rose to prominence purely through personal courage in battle. Instead, we hear of his chosen companions, often called his trusted men or close associates. Some, like Edeko, owed their standing to remarkable success in warfare, while others, such as Bericus, derived theirs from noble birth, which likely meant that their families had earned both honor and wealth through victories and plunder in earlier generations. At least one of these companions was not even a Hun, but a Roman. Orestes, who later fathered Romulus Augustulus, the final emperor of the Western Empire. These chosen men fulfilled a range of crucial duties. They frequently undertook diplomatic missions for their master, sometimes negotiating with envoys who ventured into the steppe, and often traveling themselves to Constantinople, where they received lavish gifts in the name of diplomacy. They were also tasked with protecting Attila personally, each taking turns to guard him during the day. Though they sometimes referred to this role as slavery, they carried it out with deep loyalty. Edeko himself, though briefly tempted by a Roman bribe, quickly confessed the plot to Attila, and it is possible he never truly intended to betray him. More importantly, these companions exercised authority over portions of the empire's warriors and lands. Each was entrusted with a body of troops and with oversight of subject peoples. When Attila placed his eldest son, Elik, over the conquered Akatsiri, he was following the same pattern used with his lieutenants. Bericus is described as ruling many villages in the steppes, and others like Onagesius and Edeko undoubtedly held similar positions. They governed regions of unequal size, wealth, and strategic value, and their importance was reflected in the hierarchy observed at Attila's banquets. Onagesius sat at his right hand, Bericus at his left, while lesser men, like the Roman Orestes, held places far below proven Hun warriors. These men had responsibility not only for keeping order among the subject nations, but also for extracting tribute and food. One account recalls that the Huns, who disdained farming themselves, seized the harvests of their Gothic subjects like wolves descending upon prey, forcing the Goths to labor as little more than slaves. Whether those subjected could always grow enough to sustain themselves as well as their masters is doubtful. But it was certain that the Huns never went without, even supplementing their supplies by importing grain. This system enabled them to gather larger armies than in earlier centuries, when they had relied solely on their own resources. The exact methods of collection remain unclear, but it is certain that they compelled their subjects into military service, a practice already visible in the late 4th century when newly conquered Alans were pushed to the front against the Ostrogoths, and later when Uldin invaded Thrace with Ciri fighting beside him. Attila rarely campaigned without bringing large numbers of his subject peoples, both to increase his army and to prevent rebellion in his absence. These practices reveal the harshness with which the Huns regarded their dependents. Again and again, sources describe the subjects as slaves, and after Attila's death, his heirs continued to speak of Goths as runaway slaves who had to be hunted down. In truth, the entire machinery of Attila's empire turned on these chosen men. Roman secretaries sent by Aetius, who drafted letters and kept records, were insignificant in comparison. Without his companions, Attila could not have held together such a vast and unwilling collection of peoples. The power of these lieutenants is further shown by their freedom of movement. In 449, Bericus was away from his dominions, present in Attila's camp, and even joined an embassy to Constantinople. Such absence suggests that the military force under his command was strong enough to keep his territories in line, despite the hostility of the subject population. Still, the Huns were never numerous enough to garrison their empire everywhere. Many conquered peoples were left under their own kings, but those rulers were bound in servitude to Attila. A few, however, stood nearly as equals to his companions. Ardaric, king of the Gepids, was said to share Attila's counsels because of his loyalty, and Valamir, leader of the Ostrogoths, enjoyed similar favor. For men like Ardaric, the existence of Attila's empire provided a form of security. His authority guaranteed their rule so long as they remained faithful to him. Yet most other Germanic chieftains endured a far more humiliating position. Contemporary accounts describe them as trembling at Attila's mere glance and carrying out his will instantly, like servants at his command. Even Gothic kings were forced to obey in matters of life and death, so absolute was their subjection. The empire rested on fear, loyalty bought with privilege, and the ruthless exploitation of subject peoples, and Attila's chosen lieutenants were the instruments by which his authority extended across Europe. It seems clear that part of the reason the Huns managed to hold the Goths in subjection was their willingness to cooperate with Gothic rulers. Even before the close of the 4th century, one chronicler remarked that the Goths lived under leaders of their own choosing, but these leaders held power only under the authority of the Huns. This may not have been a heroic existence for the Gothic kings, but it offered them safety. If among the Roman population it was the poorer classes who found advantage in welcoming invaders, then among the Germans it may have been the kings who played that role. Before considering the factors that eventually undermined Hunnic society, it is worth pausing to examine the place of women within this community of plunderers. For the early period, our information is scarce. One source tells us only that Hun women lived in the wagons, which served as the mobile headquarters of each band. There they passed their days sewing the rough garments worn by the men and giving birth to children. This gives the impression of a harsh, restricted existence of the kind typical for women in nomadic societies. Yet later descriptions suggest a very different reality. When Attila entered his principal settlement, women rushed out to see him, some gathering in a choir to sing songs of welcome as his horse passed by. This is hardly the behavior of secluded women kept apart from public life. On the same occasion, the wife of Onegesius emerged from her dwelling surrounded by her attendants, offering food and drink to Attila, which he accepted while still mounted, a gesture that showed his respect for her status as the wife of his closest advisor. Women were not hidden away. They mingled in public with men, and even with strangers such as the Roman envoy Priscus, who conversed freely with Attila's queen, Herica, and observed her handmaids at work on their embroidery. Even more striking is the case of one of Bleda's widows, who ruled a village after his death. Whether her authority extended only to that community or over a larger region is uncertain, but her rule stands as remarkable evidence of women exercising political authority among the Huns. Similar examples appear among related peoples. The Utiguri once had a female chieftain, and in the days of Justinian, the Sabiri, were led by Boirex, who assumed leadership after her husband died. Far from being secluded, these women held positions of dignity and respect, recalling later descriptions of early Mongol and Turkic societies where widows could inherit both property and leadership until their sons were old enough to take over. The household structure of the Huns reinforces this impression. Onegesius lived in a palisaded enclosure containing not only his wife and servants, but also members of his extended clan, along with a considerable number of slaves and servant girls. This arrangement seems typical rather than exceptional. It was closely linked with the practice of polygamy, which was not limited to rulers, but seems to have been widespread. Together, these features suggest a social structure resembling what anthropologists have called the patriarchal family. In such a household, the father or male head held absolute authority over both people and property, including livestock. Yet, despite this dominance of the male, Hunnic women had not been entirely reduced to dependence. The evidence of their public presence, their occasional leadership, and their role in household organization indicates that they retained a measure of dignity unusual in many other nomadic societies. The growing wealth of the Huns, while altering many aspects of their society, had not yet changed the role of women in any profound way. What it did transform, however, was the position of the military leader. A man like Attila could only maintain authority so long as he kept his followers well supplied and richly rewarded. On the steppe, where loyalty was fluid, a strong and generous lord attracted warriors, while one who failed to provide, like Ulden earlier in the century, quickly lost them. Attila understood this perfectly. He secured loyalty by distributing the choicest spoils of war, by sending his companions on embassies to Constantinople, where they could profit handsomely, and by ensuring that booty and tribute flowed without interruption, at least until the final years of his reign. Those closest to him, his chosen captains and companions, lived in remarkable luxury. They possessed silks, Indian pearls, gold and silver plates, jeweled bridles, and fine beds covered in embroidered hangings. At banquets, they dined not only on meat, once reserved for rare occasions among nomads, but also on imported delicacies such as pepper and dates. They drank wine as well as mead and beer, and their feasts, which began in the late afternoon, often continued through the night. Attila's great hall and the residences of his lieutenants were equipped with Roman-style furniture, tables, and couches, in stark contrast to the earlier generations of Huns, who lived entirely in wagons and shunned permanent dwellings. Yet this display of wealth also revealed the weakness of their society. Few of these luxuries were produced by the Huns themselves. Their economy was far too limited. While the ruling elite reveled in fine goods, many ordinary Huns still lived in poverty. As late as the mid-5th century, some clans could offer visiting Roman envoys nothing but millet, having no bread to provide. The grandeur of Hun society under Attila depended not on internal productivity, but on a steady supply of tribute, plunder, and gifts. Beyond these sources, however, there was another essential factor: trade. No nomadic people could survive solely on their herds. Exchange with settled neighbors was vital, and it was this need that first drew the Huns into contact with Roman frontier towns. Ancient writers often overlooked this reality, but it was the key to the survival of every steppe confederation. Among the Huns, the demand for linen clothing, fine skins, and especially weapons ensured constant trade with settled populations. The steppe itself lacked resources like timber and iron, and Hun craftsmanship was too limited to meet the needs of large-scale warfare. Even their bows, though crafted from horn and bone, required materials they could not always supply in abundance. This dependence was not unique to them. Centuries later, the Mongols too were forced to import arms from China and Persia when they launched major campaigns, and the Avars who succeeded the Huns openly purchased weapons from Byzantine factories. The Huns faced the same dilemma. For all their fearsome reputation, their armies could not have been equipped without the steady inflow of goods from the very civilizations they threatened. When envoys from the steppe once attempted to buy arms in imperial markets, the Romans accepted payment, promptly arrested them, and seized the weapons. This incident reveals the crucial distinction between different peoples who imported Roman goods. Germanic tribes, for example, left countless deposits of Roman weapons and armor across their lands, yet with their own forests and mines, they could have managed without such imports if necessary. Persia too sought Roman iron in the 4th century, but its armies remained formidable even without it. The Huns and later nomadic confederations such as the Avars and Turks, however, stood in a different category. Without a steady flow of imported weapons, they could not conduct large-scale wars. To arms and linen clothing must also be added grain. Roman records show that grain was imported for the Huns as early as 409, although poets sometimes claimed that the common nomads did not eat it. Likely, grain and bread were luxuries reserved for the elite, while the ordinary horsemen lived on simpler fare. Trade itself was largely managed by the ruling class, and the goods acquired, swords, clothing, grain, and a handful of luxuries, went primarily to them. In exchange, the Huns offered what nomadic peoples always had: horses, furs, meat, and, above all, slaves. Even in Attila's day, Roman envoys expected to find these commodities available for purchase whenever they visited his dominions. By this period, luxury trade had become a central pillar of Attila's empire. To understand Hun society, it is essential to recognize that this trade was more than mere prestige. It was the mechanism that bound Attila's closest followers to him. His chosen companions owed him their loyalty only because he could supply treasures on a scale none of his rivals could match. The nomads had long since moved beyond the days when leadership was temporary and no one man ruled them. Wealth had divided their society, creating a ruling stratum that thrived on gifts and luxuries. The Eastern Romans were fully aware of this dependence. Trade with Constantinople and the Danubian markets was the lifeline of the Huns. Coin finds in modern Romania tell the story clearly. Pieces from earlier Western emperors are common until the late 4th century, but after Theodosius I, Western coinage virtually disappears, while gold struck by Eastern rulers such as Arcadius, Theodosius II, Marcian, and Leo I is abundant. This suggests that the Eastern Empire enjoyed a near monopoly of trade with the steppe, a fact that later gave it great political leverage. It is impossible to know how trade shaped the rise of early Hun leaders such as Uldin or Donatus, but historians agree that the very existence of profitable exchanges between nomads and settled communities naturally encouraged the use of military power to control markets and eventually to exact tribute. For merchants in the Roman frontier towns, Hun domination may even have been welcome, since it brought a degree of order that allowed commerce to flourish. Contemporary anecdotes reveal individual traders who found themselves more prosperous under the Huns than within the empire. One renegade Greek told Priscus he had lived better among Attila's people than he ever had in the Roman city of Viminatium. Another case, decades later, records a merchant from Apamea advising Hun raiders during a campaign against Persia. Although our sources rarely dwell on trade, there can be little doubt that it was carried on at a vast scale. The enormous sums of gold paid out by the emperors in tribute must eventually have flowed back into the empire through commercial exchange. Traders, slave dealers, and frontier merchants all profited. However reluctantly, the emperors themselves viewed these payments. For many Roman subjects, the existence of the Hun Empire was not merely a menace, but also a guarantee of prosperity. Trade also left its mark on diplomacy. As early as Rua's day, Roman governments were compelled to grant market privileges to Hun envoys. Attila, in his treaties, insisted on safe and open access to Roman towns for his merchants, and in the mid-5th century, he successfully pressured the empire to relocate the principal market from Illyria to Naissus, advancing his influence deeper into the Balkans. While this demand had obvious strategic motives, it also reflected the vital importance of trade in sustaining his power. Attila himself may not have realized how decisive this issue would become for his successors, but the stability of his empire and the loyalty of his magnates rested upon it. By the mid-5th century, Hun society, as observed by Priscus, had become less a community of pastoral nomads and more a parasitic empire sustained by conquest and tribute. The evidence suggests that they no longer followed the seasonal migrations of herders, but had turned instead to ruling over other peoples and exploiting their labor. Wealth had introduced sharp differences among them. While ordinary warriors needed basic goods and a few luxuries, the elite required costly gifts and privileges to mark their superior rank. Attila secured these through relentless military pressure on both subject peoples and the Eastern Roman Empire. Without a steady supply of tribute, trading privileges, and imported weapons, it was uncertain what could hold Hun society together. One major weakness lay in the dispersal of their fighting men across a vast domain stretching from the Caucasus to the frontiers of France and Denmark. The Huns could not garrison such lands without relying on allied kings like Ardaric and other Germanic rulers whom Attila left in power. To maintain this fragile balance, he demanded the return of every Hun prisoner held by the Romans, even when the numbers were small. While he claimed this was to keep men out of the Roman army, a deeper reason was likely his need for forced labor. Like other nomadic conquerors, the Huns probably imported peasants from captured lands to cultivate the soil on their behalf, preserving the nomadic character of their own society while exploiting outsiders as agricultural workers. Captives from Syria, the Balkans, and beyond were almost certainly set to work in this way, for they had little ransom value. Attila's constant insistence on their return reflects his awareness of the fragile foundations of his rule. His military fortunes worsened in the final years. Though victorious in some battles, he suffered heavy losses against the Romans in the Balkans, was checked in Gaul in 451, and repulsed from Italy in 452 by famine and plague. His sudden death the next year left his empire divided among quarreling sons. Civil wars followed, culminating in the great defeat at the river Nadao, where many thousands of Huns perished and their eldest prince fell. With no secure way to provide their followers with wealth and prestige, Attila's former companions abandoned unity and tried to build their own power bases. The Eastern Romans, under Emperor Marcian, took advantage of this collapse. Although we lack direct proof, it is highly likely that they encouraged the subject peoples to rise after Attila's death. Two decisive measures reveal how well they understood the Hun economy. First, they closed the Danubian market towns to Hun traders, depriving them of essential imports and cutting off the flow of luxuries that sustained the loyalty of the elite. Second, Marcian outlawed the export of weapons and materials for making them, a deliberate blow aimed at a people unable to arm themselves without outside help. Together, these acts destroyed the economic basis of Hun power and ensured that no successor could restore the empire Attila had built. The contradictions in Hun society had long been evident. The more wealth Attila distributed, the greater the need for even more costly luxuries to satisfy his followers, and the wider his empire spread, the thinner his already limited manpower was stretched. By the time his sons failed at Nidau, the Huns had no productive resources of their own. They depended entirely on tribute, subject peoples, and Roman trade. Once that was cut off, their power dissolved, leaving leaders like Dengizek begging along the frontier for land and provisions. After the empire's fall, the old chaos of nomadic life returned to the steppe. Small warlords gathered bands of followers, raiding one another in endless cycles of violence and desertion. Later sources even preserve the story of a descendant of Attila, a Hun named Mundo, who wandered beyond the Danube with a gang of outlaws and robbers. Establishing himself in a ruined tower, he raided his neighbors until captured and forced into service by a Gothic king. Such tales illustrate the fate of Attila's once mighty people. Reduced from rulers of Europe to scattered raiders, their society fragmented beyond repair. Mundo was one of the few who managed to secure a future after the collapse of the Huns. Following Theodoric's death, he entered Roman service and rose to high command, becoming master of the soldiers in Illyricum by 530. In that role, he successfully defeated a band of Huns and other raiders. Few descendants of Attila could have hoped for such fortune. By this time, Hun society had reverted to something far closer to what Ammianus had described in the 4th century. Their larger confederacy had vanished, and with it the structures of empire. But the older framework of clans and tribal groups tied by blood endured. These smaller units proved resilient, often surviving the collapse of greater organizations. Shortly after Attila's death, we still hear of tribes such as the Ultzinzurs, Angesiri, Bitugures, and Bardores, following his son Dengizek. One of these groups, the Ultzinzures, almost certainly took their name from Ultzindur, a relative of Attila. He seems to have been a man of some distinction during the height of Hun power, and once Attila was gone, he was able to gather a following of his own. Even after his death, the tribe that bore his name continued, showing how steppe peoples often created new clans from the memory of celebrated leaders. This process meant that, over time, the steppe became filled again with minor chieftains, men like Attila's sons, Edeko, Chelchal, or Mundo himself, each ruling only a fragment of what had once been a great empire. They fought one another, battled against neighboring tribes, or hired themselves and their bands out as mercenaries in Roman or barbarian armies. Yet no figure emerged with the authority or resources to unite them into another vast confederacy. The reason lay not only in their own fragmentation, but also in the arrival of fresh, powerful peoples moving into Eastern Europe during the later 5th century. Their appearance permanently changed the balance of power, ensuring that the Huns would never again rise to dominance. In the early years of Hun incursions, the outlook of the Roman government remains hidden from us. The records are too fragmented to reveal how the ministers of Theodosius I, or Arcadius, viewed these new enemies. Only by the 440s, thanks to Priscus, do we gain a glimpse of the motives shaping Eastern policy. Yet even here, caution is necessary. His accounts are factually reliable, but his interpretation of those facts cannot be accepted uncritically. It is hardly likely that Priscus, alone among ancient historians, wrote without prejudice or partiality. To judge his value as an interpreter, we must look closely at his own words. His social views are especially revealing. During his stay in Attila's camp, Priscus encountered a Greek merchant who had once prospered in Viminacium before its fall in 441. Captured by the Huns, he had been taken by Onegesius, one of their leaders, since Hun custom dictated that wealthy captives were assigned to the chiefs, who could profit more from their ransom. This man had fought bravely for his new master against the Romans in several campaigns and bought back his freedom with the spoils he gained. By the time Priscus met him, he had taken a Hun wife, fathered children, and lived in greater comfort among the Huns than he had once enjoyed in the empire. He explained that life under Roman rule had been far worse. In war, citizens perished because of incompetent generals and the lack of armed resistance among the population. In peace, life was crushed by heavy taxes and by the corruption of the courts. Wealthy offenders could evade justice, while the poor suffered its full weight, enduring endless lawsuits and being forced to spend their meager resources on bribes. Voices like his are rare in the sources. Merchants and traders of the late empire seldom speak to us. But here, when they do, they expose the empire's deepest problems: oppressive taxation, military incompetence, and corrupt justice. The question is how Priscus responded. Other writers, such as Ammianus or Olympiodorus, had denounced these injustices with anger, but Priscus's answer was strikingly different. He replied with philosophical platitudes, claiming that the Roman constitution had been wisely framed. Some were destined to guard the laws, some to bear arms, and some to farm the land and feed the rest. The law courts, he insisted, were fair, and the delays in trials were caused only by judges' concern to avoid rash verdicts. Justice, he argued, favored no class, for even the emperor was bound by the laws. This lofty response bore little relation to reality, as his contemporary Theodoret made clear when he wrote that the poor man feared judges and courts above all else, for the system weighed doubly hard upon him. Priscus went further, claiming that Roman masters treated their slaves more kindly than Attila treated his subjects. Romans, he said, corrected their slaves as fathers or teachers corrected children, an idea echoed by Theodoret, who described masters as benefactors and slaves as naturally loyal to them. But this comparison only highlighted how detached Priscus was from the harsh realities around him. His lofty reply, modeled on the style of Socratic debate, sounded wise but was empty of truth. Instead of acknowledging corruption and oppression, he chose complacency and defended the established order. Such an attitude might have pleased Augustus, who once remarked that anyone wishing to preserve the existing order unchanged was a good citizen and a good man. But in the crumbling world of the 5th century, such complacency was indefensible. Priscus may faithfully recount the events of his age, but his refusal to confront its social realities casts doubt on his ability to understand the world he described. When we turn from Priscus's social outlook to his political judgments, a clear pattern emerges. Although his surviving comments are not numerous, they consistently reveal his attitudes. He showed little regard for high-ranking officials who, in his view, failed to act with firmness. Senator, consul in 436, and later a patrician at the Council of Chalcedon, is treated with contempt because, though entrusted with an embassy, he lacked the courage to travel to Attila's camp by land and instead sailed to meet the military commander at Odessus. Similarly, Theodulus and Anatolius are sharply criticized for their submissive behavior when negotiating with Attila. Anatolius, despite a distinguished career that included major military commands, a consulship, and even public works in Antioch, is portrayed as weak when he and Nomus bribed Attila to secure peace. Nomus himself, once one of the most powerful officials at the court of Theodosius II, also falls under this shadow. For Priscus, these men represented a policy of appeasement tied to the influence of the eunuch Chrysaphius, and this policy he regarded as cowardly. He accuses the entire administration of Theodosius II of obeying Attila as though he were their master. Yet Priscus is not entirely unfair. He admits that the government faced enormous difficulties at the time, with threats from Persia, the Vandals, the Isaurians, the Saracens, and even the Ethiopians. Still, his description makes it clear that he regarded such a catalogue of crises as an indictment of poor policy, and he concludes with the scathing observation that the government had humbled itself before Attila. By contrast, he lavishes praise on those who resisted the barbarians with courage. Apollonius, a supporter of Zeno, is warmly commended for his bold defiance of Attila during his embassy in 450. The citizens of Assemus, who dared to attack and defeat a group of Attila's warriors in 443, are described in detail and with admiration. The same attitude appears in his approval of a bishop named Bleda, who spoke defiantly to the Vandal king Gaiseric, and in his admiration for Aegidius, whose determined defense of the Western Empire against the Goths impressed him deeply. But his most glowing tribute is reserved for Euphemius, master of the offices under Marcian. Priscus credits him with guiding the emperor's policies and initiating the beneficial reforms of the reign, including the decisive break with the policy of Chrysaphius. Subsidies to the Huns were stopped, and a stronger, more assertive stance was adopted. It is revealing, too, that Priscus raises no objection to the trickery employed by Roman generals such as Anagast and Kelchel, who set Goths and Huns against one another through deceit. He shows no moral qualms about the concealment of the true purpose of Maximinus's embassy, which included the plan to assassinate Attila. Most strikingly, he even echoes the view expressed by the men of Assemus that swearing a false oath in order to save one's own people is not true perjury. From all this, it is clear that Priscus admired boldness and uncompromising resistance above all else. Anyone who faced the barbarians with firmness won his approval, while those who yielded or relied on bribes stood condemned. His patriotism, however, came at a cost. In his eagerness to applaud courage, he was willing to excuse deceit and treachery, practices which earlier Roman writers would have denounced as dishonorable. Can we take the inquiry further and ask what lay behind Priscus' patriotism? The reign of Marcian strongly favored the landed aristocracy. True, Marcian himself declared that the emperor's task was to care for the welfare of humankind, but in practice, he meant primarily the interests of the great landowners. As one contemporary put it, his policy was to leave untouched the fortunes of the wealthy. His legislation largely reinforced their position. He reduced the number of senators liable for the costly office of praetor and abolished the tax on senatorial estates. With such measures in mind, it is striking that modern historians often repeat the verdict that Marcian was one of the best emperors to rule in Constantinople. For the senatorial class, this may have been true, but others were not so well served. By contrast, The merchants and traders were those who stood to gain from the earlier policy of subsidies and trade agreements with the Huns. Priscus's hostility to Theodosius II and to the policy of the eunuch Chrysaphius seems closely connected with his own attachment to the interests of the landowning elite. One fragment of Priscus is especially revealing. He describes the aftermath of the Hun invasion of 441 to 443, when new taxes had to be imposed to pay the large sum promised to Attila in the Treaty of 443. Priscus dismisses the government's claim that the treaty was voluntary, insisting it was made under duress. He complains bitterly about the way the money was raised, denouncing in particular the burden laid upon senators. His account paints a dramatic picture. Wealthy families reduced to selling their furniture and their wives' jewelry in the marketplace, and some driven to suicide by hunger or despair. Yet this seems highly exaggerated. The lump sum owed to Attila was 6,000 pounds of gold. Even if there were fewer than 1,000 senators in the East, many of them had annual incomes measured in tens of thousands of solidi. Such men should have been able to meet the obligation without ruin. The story of families pawning their ornaments looks more like rhetorical flourish than sober fact. Indeed, payments of this kind were neither unusual nor regarded as intolerable. A generation later, Leo I agreed to pay Theodoric Strabo 2,000 pounds of gold per year, and in 478, Zeno gave Theodoric another immense subsidy in gold and silver. In both cases, there was no sign of outrage in Constantinople. Marcian himself was not opposed to giving money to barbarians, so long as it was treated as a gift rather than tribute, and he spent freely on his eastern frontier. The truth seems to be that Priscus objected less to the sums themselves than to the way they were raised. His sympathies lay with the senators, and his history reflects their grievances. If we compare the burden of 6,000 pounds of gold with the staggering expense of Leo's failed expedition against the Vandals in 468, more than 100,000 pounds, it becomes clear that the earlier payment could not have bankrupted the senatorial order. Marcian, far from finding an empty treasury, left behind a surplus of gold. The dramatic picture drawn by Priscus belongs more to the conventions of rhetorical history than to economic reality. His description of senators forced to sell their household goods and their wives' ornaments echoes a similar line used earlier by another historian about the reign of Theodosius I. In this case, it seems Priscus borrowed the phrase to sharpen his indictment of Theodosius II. In truth, the senatorial class kept its wealth, and their wives kept their jewelry. The policy pursued by Theodosius II and his minister Chrysaphius in 443, when they raised funds to satisfy Attila's demands, placed the main burden on the senatorial aristocracy. Yet this approach had the advantage of sparing the wider population of the eastern provinces from heavier taxation. How else could such a vast sum have been raised without causing widespread misery? There is a useful precedent from earlier in the century. In 408, Alaric demanded payment for services rendered, but the imperial treasury was empty. Since peace was essential and regular taxation could not provide the money quickly enough, the government of Honorius proposed a special levy on those with ready wealth. The senators. The Senate debated whether war should be declared against the Goths, but in truth, everyone knew that if Alaric's terms were accepted, the aristocracy would bear the cost. Stilicho defended the policy of buying peace, arguing that it was far less dangerous and far less expensive than a campaign whose outcome was uncertain. The majority accepted his reasoning, though not without resentment, and 4,000 pounds of gold were voted to Alaric. One senator, Lampadius, famously cried out that this was not peace, but slavery. His outburst reflected more concern for his own purse than for Roman honor. It is hard to escape the conclusion that many Eastern senators felt the same in 443. They understood the logic of Theodosius's decision, but accepted it grudgingly, driven as much by fear of Chrysaphius as by conviction. The difference was that in the East, a handful of senators, Anatolius, Nomus, Senator, and others, supported the policy even though it meant personal loss. Their opponents, however, later found their voice through Priscus. This perspective forces us to reassess Priscus's supposed patriotism. His hostility to the weak foreign policy of Chrysaphius had less to do with national honor and more with loyalty to a social class whose wealth was threatened. His concern was not for the empire as a whole, but for the landed elite. In this respect, his outlook was narrower than that of earlier historians like Olympiodorus, who openly criticized the extreme inequalities of wealth, or Ammianus, who, though linked to senators himself, was uneasy about their vast fortunes and their grip on politics. Priscus's attitude is closer to that of Malchus of Philadelphia, who later condemned Emperor Leo I for paying subsidies to barbarians, even though Leo's policies brought peace and, as some admitted, earned him the admiration of the common people. Seen in this light, Priscus' attack on the policies of Theodosius II and Chrysaphius is marked by bias and partiality. The strategy of 443 was intended to place the extraordinary burdens of empire on those best able to carry them, and there is little reason to believe that it crushed the senatorial order as Priscus implies. On the contrary, if Theodosius and Chrysaphius had truly ruled as tyrants, the emperor's memory would not have been fondly remembered generations later, when the Greens still invoked his name in the year 583. Even Priscus himself, despite being an opponent of Chrysaphius, was forced to acknowledge the broad support that the eunuch enjoyed at the height of his power in 449, when threats from Attila and Zeno endangered his life. Priscus noted that everyone gave him good wishes and support. That such a testimony came from an enemy makes it all the more significant, and it undermines the case Priscus was otherwise trying to build against Theodosius' minister. It might be argued that Theodosius should not have relied on paying off Attila, but ought to have faced him directly in battle, bringing an end to the constant demands for tribute. Yet such criticism ignores the fundamental imbalance between an agricultural empire like Rome and a mobile nomadic power like the Huns. As early as the 5th century BC, Herodotus had pointed out that nomadic peoples living in wagons, moving freely across the plains, fighting entirely as mounted archers, and feeding themselves from their herds were almost impossible for a settled state to subdue. A nomadic population could vanish with little effort, taking their possessions with them and leaving an invading army with nothing to capture or plunder. Moreover, the expense of mounting a punitive expedition was immense, while the likely gains were minimal. This problem was not unique to Rome. The Chinese court, for centuries, debated whether the steppe nomads to their north should be fought or appeased with gifts. The most prudent voices generally argued against large-scale invasions, since they tended to end in failure and devastation. In fact, throughout their history, the Romans almost never attempted punitive campaigns against the Huns. The sole exception came in 452, when Marcian sent troops into Hun territory, while Attila's main forces were occupied in Italy, hoping to stir rebellion among the Germanic tribes left under Hun rule. No such opportunity had ever presented itself to Theodosius. To condemn him for failing to send expeditions across the Danube is to ignore the realities he faced. The The costs would have been crushing, the results negligible, and the danger of catastrophic losses all too real. Even though Attila's reliance on fixed tribute and food supplies in Central Europe reduced some of his mobility, he could still afford to abandon certain regions temporarily, while on the open steppe he could easily annihilate a Roman army. And any Roman offensive would almost certainly have provoked Hun retaliation, bringing ferocious raids that devastated farmland and depopulated whole provinces. The difficulties of dealing with Hun prisoners reveal the same dilemma. In 409, when Uldin invaded Thrace with a force of Syri allies, many of the Syri were captured after their defeat. Sozomen records that the Romans could neither keep them concentrated in Thrace nor easily dispose of them. Some were sold cheaply, others given away on condition they not remain in Europe, while large numbers were sent to work as tenant farmers on imperial estates in Bithynia. If even the Syri created such difficulties, Hun captives would have been more troublesome still. They were useless as agricultural laborers, and the only realistic hope was that they might serve as mercenaries. But the citizens of Asimus, when they captured Hun attackers, immediately executed them, showing that even as soldiers, they were seen as too dangerous to keep alive. Against this background, it is misleading to dismiss the policy of Theodosius and Chrysaphius as weak. Subsidies were not a matter of choice, but of necessity. Marcian's later intervention in 452 was only possible because of the new circumstances created by Attila's decline, not because he had adopted a fundamentally stronger policy. Theodosius's measures after the disasters of 441 to 443 show a government adapting to harsh realities. A capital levy on senators was designed to avoid heavier burdens on the general population, who were already suffering from poor harvests, disease, and earthquakes. The invasion of 447, whose cause remains uncertain, does not prove incompetence on the part of Theodosius or his ministers. The unfavorable picture of this policy owes much to the perspective of Priscus. His ties to Maximinus, and especially to Euphemius, who under Marcian reversed the earlier approach, influenced his interpretation. Although not himself of the highest rank in Constantinople, Priscus sympathized with the landed elite who had borne the brunt of the extraordinary levies, and he resented a policy that shielded the wider population at their expense. His lack of military understanding made him less capable of grasping why subsidies were not only practical, but essential. In reality, the measures of Theodosius and Chrysaphius were designed to protect the majority of the population from even greater suffering, while their critics, speaking through the pages of Priscus, represented the grievances of a single privileged class. If the government of Theodosius, guided by Chrysaphius, really acted with the interests of the broader population in mind, why then does the historical tradition almost unanimously condemn the eunuch? The reason is not difficult to uncover. The principal authority for this period was the history written by Priscus, and his work, while detailed, was far from impartial. Later historians relied heavily on him, repeating his judgments without question. Most of these later writers were Orthodox Christians who already viewed Theodosius and Chrysaphius with hostility, not only because of politics, but also because of religion. Theodosius in his later years, and Chrysaphius even more openly, were supporters of the controversial monk Eutyches, which made them objects of suspicion and dislike in the eyes of the Orthodox majority. Thus, when these historians encountered Priscus's harsh criticisms, they accepted them readily and wove them into their own accounts. It is important, however, to notice that not every contemporary shared this hostility. Socrates, the church historian, praises Theodosius warmly. It would have been unsafe for him to publish direct attacks on a reigning emperor. But if he had been critical, he could at least have toned down his approval. The fact that he did not suggests genuine respect. Nestorius, by contrast, condemned Theodosius fiercely for personal reasons. His testimony, however, also sheds light on why many Orthodox writers disliked the emperor. In order to raise the gold demanded by Attila, Theodosius, through Chrysaphius, compelled the church to contribute. Flavian, Patriarch of Constantinople, complied reluctantly and publicly dramatized his displeasure. When pressed for payment, he claimed poverty, saying that even if the church sold all its property, it would not meet the required sum. Finally, he declared that he would melt down the sacred vessels themselves, which he proceeded to do in public to stir resentment. Theodosius, however, merely insisted that he wanted the gold owed to the state, regardless of its source. In truth, the emperor's claim was not unreasonable. The empire had been struck by famine, plague, earthquakes, and repeated invasions, and every resource was needed for survival. One might argue that the church, which had benefited from imperial generosity in the past, had a moral duty to share the burden in this time of crisis. Flavian's theatrical protest created bitterness, but it should not obscure the fact that the government was struggling to keep the population alive in the face of overwhelming disasters. This background explains why most Orthodox Christian writers painted Theodosius and Chrysaphius in such a negative light. Yet Monophysite authors present a different picture. Zachariah of Mytilene spoke of Theodosius with respect and saved his bitterness for Marcion. John Malalas, also sympathetic to Monophysite views, described Theodosius as loved by the people and admired even by the Senate, though this last point was surely an exaggeration, since the landowning class had little reason to cherish him. It is therefore difficult to accept the sweeping condemnation of Chrysaphius. John Malalas even notes that Theodosius valued him personally, describing him as attractive and well-favored. In the end, Chrysaphius lost his life when a new, senator-friendly emperor came to power. Accusations of extortion were inevitable, for in the late empire any minister could be charged with exploiting the oppressive tax system. What truly sealed his fate was not corruption, but the fact that his policies had run against the interests of the aristocracy. His financial measures had shifted burdens away from ordinary taxpayers, favoring the wider population at the expense of wealthy landowners. The ultimate failure of his religious policy alienated much of the populace and helped prepare the way for future disaffection in the eastern provinces. Yet the tradesmen and artisans of Constantinople remembered Theodosius with affection long after his death, even into the late 6th century. The consistently negative portrait handed down to us owes more to the hostility of the senatorial class, and to Priscus in particular, than to any fair assessment of his government. We have now attempted to piece together the story of the political and military activities of the Huns, from their first assault on the Ostrogoths to the disappearance of Attila's sons after his death. Alongside this, we have tried to sketch the society in which the Huns lived, the changes it underwent, and the reasons for its collapse. Yet in both efforts we have been severely handicapped by the poverty of the evidence. We know almost nothing of the scale or structure of the Hun Empire in the years immediately before Bleda and Attila took command, and we lack precise details about the role played by Attila, or even Rua, in building and expanding it. Likewise, when we turn to Hun society, our information is drawn only from scattered remarks. Without a few stray words from Priscus, for example, we would know nothing about their family life, nor would we have any direct testimony that they extracted food from their subjects, though such a practice might have been guessed from the circumstances. It is unlikely that any new literary sources will appear, and archaeology seems unlikely to provide dramatic discoveries in the near future. So it is worth setting down some general conclusions. First, we must examine the widespread belief that Attila was a man of genius, a towering figure whose personality alone held the Hun Empire together. Second, we should consider the broader significance of the Huns' impact on Europe. What difference did it make that they clashed with Goths and Romans, rather than directing their strength against Persians or Indians? The common opinion that the Hun ascendancy rested solely on Attila's genius cannot be sustained. It is untrue to say there was no Hun Empire before him. Even though sources stress that he ruled over more nations than any of his predecessors, the same accounts imply that the realm of Rua and Oktar was already vast and powerful. Only a few years after Oktar was active near the Rhine, Rua was interfering in Italian politics and threatening the Romans on the Danube. Their reach was already immense. Attila, therefore, did not create his empire from nothing, as Chinggis Khan later did with the Mongols. Rather, he inherited a large and developed confederation. The men who built this framework, Rua and his brothers, deserve as much credit for the Hun ascendancy as Attila himself, just as Chinggis deserves credit for the successes of his heirs. Nor can it be maintained that the empire's collapse after Attila's death was inevitable. Chinggis Khan had heirs able to preserve and expand his dominion. There is no reason in principle why the Huns might not have produced successors of similar caliber. The rise and fall of their power cannot be explained solely by the abilities of one man. What then was Attila's supposed genius? Was he a master of war? The evidence does not compel such a conclusion. He defeated the Eastern Romans in 441 to 443. But in 441, there was scarcely any opposition. And in 443, he faced troops hurriedly shifted from Sicily who had already been demoralized by years of inaction. In 447, when he met a fully prepared Eastern army, he won, but at the cost of heavy losses. The brief ancient description of the battle on the river Utus gives no hint of brilliant strategy. Even if we grant that he twice bested the forces of the East in open combat, this hardly proves exceptional generalship. 2 victories over an army weakened by internal divisions and reliant on reluctant peasants do not establish him as a military genius. His real test came in Gaul. There, facing Western Germans whose society was still relatively united, he failed. The legend of saddles piled into a funeral pyre on the plains of Champagne, whether true or not, symbolizes defeat rather than triumph. On ground he himself had chosen, commanding an army at the peak of its power, he failed against a coalition of uneasy allies, undone by the determination of free warriors. If not a great general, was Attila a brilliant diplomat? Again, the evidence suggests otherwise. His campaign in the West might well have succeeded had he handled his preparations wisely. In 449, 3 conditions were essential. He needed to keep the Visigoths and Western Romans divided, to manage the appeal of Honoria with caution, and to prevent his enemies from closing ranks. He began by planning to strike the Visigoths while posing as an ally of Ravenna, a shrewd idea given the ability of Aetius. But he mishandled Honoria's appeal so clumsily that it brought Visigoths and Romans together against him. Considering the strained relations between Ravenna and Toulouse in the decades before 451, such unity was far from inevitable. Attila's diplomacy, rather than his military failures alone, helped create it. Only a blunderer of the highest order could have driven Attius and Theodoric into one another's arms. Yet Attila managed to do just that. This was not a masterstroke, but a grave mistake. A second error was his failure to make use of Gaiseric. The Vandal king was eager for Attila to attack the Visigoths, and could have been an invaluable ally. Coordinated naval assaults on Italy in 452, or even on Gaul in 451, might have decisively supported Attila's land campaigns. Yet there is no sign that Attila tried to rouse Gaiseric, a man who had built his life around attacking the Western Romans. Few leaders in history have squandered such a willing and capable partner. The third and most telling reason why Attila cannot be called a brilliant diplomat lies in his handling of Eudoxius. After fleeing to the Huns in 448, Eudoxius disappears from the record. Had Attila placed himself at the head of the peasant rebels in Gaul, both Visigoths and Romans might have been swept aside within months. Instead, the Armoricans, who could have been his allies, fought alongside Aetius at the Catalaunian plains. The case is therefore reduced to absurdity. Attila could never have posed as the champion of oppressed peasants. For him, peasants were simply resources, little different from the dependents of his German vassal kings, producers of food and livestock to sustain his warriors. He had no desire to overthrow the landed order. He himself was perhaps the greatest landholder in Europe. Attila's talents were limited by the limitations of the society that shaped him. A true diplomatic genius could not emerge from a people whose social structure made lasting alliances impossible, and no Roman or German leader can seriously have thought otherwise. If we still insist that so imposing a figure must have possessed some measure of greatness, we may turn to Mommsen's view that Attila's real achievement lay in strengthening central authority among the Huns. Absolute certainty is impossible, since we do not know exactly how the role of military leader evolved between Rua's time and Attila's. Still, the contrast is striking. Rua, until the last years of his life, shared his power with his brothers Octar and Mundiuk. Even after Octar's death in 430, Rua could not force every Hun tribe into submission. Groups such as the Amilzuri, Itimari, Tunsures, and Boishi sought to preserve the independence they had enjoyed before Rua's confederacy, and he died before he could bend them fully to his will. Attila, by contrast, faced no such limits after he killed Bleda in 445. By the time Priscus visited him in 449, his rule was absolute and unquestioned. It is hard to believe that the Huns under Rua had yet surrendered so completely their fierce sense of independence. In this light, Mommsen's judgment seems sound. Attila's strength lay in perceiving the direction in which Hun society was evolving, and in realizing that unity under one unquestioned leader could turn the Huns into a uniquely powerful instrument for exploiting the peoples of Central Europe. Without such unity, they might have faded away like many nomadic groups before them. Attila not only saw this potential, but succeeded in giving it form. He may not have invented the institution of chosen companions, for leaders before him seem to have had similar retainers, but he almost certainly developed it and shaped it into its final structure. Instead of depending on unruly tribal chiefs, he built his power on loyal vassals like Onegesius, Bericus, and Edico, men personally bound to him without the distractions of tribal allegiance. Although we lack a full description of Hun society under Rua, and must therefore speak with caution, it is reasonable to believe that Mommsen's assessment is broadly correct. Yet even if we credit Attila with strengthening central authority, we must also recognize that it was Rua who laid the groundwork for his nephew's power. Before considering the long-term consequences of the Huns for European history, It is important to stress a fact that emerges repeatedly. The survival of the Hun Empire quickly became a vested interest in many parts of Europe. In the West, Aetius, the defender of the aristocracy, relied almost entirely on Hun auxiliaries between 425 and 439, supplied by Rua and Attila, and he maintained cordial relations with the Hun leaders up until the campaign in Gaul in 451. Even after that, he seems not to have believed the Huns would ever seriously threaten Italy. He probably imagined that cooperation with Attila would continue for years after the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Otherwise, it is hard to explain his astonishing failure to guard the Alpine passes in 452. The great landowners, whose interests Aetius defended, must have felt the same way. Avitus complained of Hun lawlessness on his estate in 436, and the invasion of 451 was terrifying. But who besides the Huns could protect aristocratic estates against Visigoths, Burgundians, and Bagaudae? It is reasonable to conclude that in the 400s and 30s and 400s and 40s, the landholding class of the West was inclined to see the Hun Empire as a useful ally. Still, not all men agreed. Some criticized Aetius in 447 for doing nothing to attack the Huns when they struck the Eastern Empire. Their voices were raised again in 452, when Attila crossed the Julian Alps unopposed. These critics likely shared the views of Salvian, who declared that it was better to live in exile among the Huns than to remain a poor man under Roman rule. In the East, the picture was different. The landowners there wanted Attila destroyed, and when Marcian took power in 450, promising to safeguard the wealth of the rich, military action soon followed that contributed to the collapse of Hun rule in Central Europe. It was not the aristocracy, but the merchants, traders, and manufacturers who supported Theodosius's earlier policies. The reason is clear. Stable relations with the Huns allowed commerce to flourish. The situation recalls the merchants who rushed to Mongolia after Chinggis Khan established order, eager to profit from his new empire. In the same way, East Roman merchants must have welcomed the stability created by Attila. Even before the Huns arrived, frontier towns along the Danube relied on trade with the Visigoths, whose survival depended on it. When Valens cut off trade in the 360s, Athanaric quickly sought peace because his people faced famine. Compared with the Visigoths, however, the Huns were far better customers, receiving over 2,000 pounds of Roman gold each year. Consider the case of Eustace, the Syrian merchant from Apamea. Under Attila, he could have traveled securely from the Caspian to the Rhine with his goods, but after the empire collapsed, he was forced to join a ragged band of Huns on the Persian frontier, hoping for scraps from their raids. He must have longed for the relative safety of Attila's reign. It is even possible that some Germanic kings were content under Attila's overlordship. If they were dissatisfied, they failed to recognize the advantages their situation offered. But in all this, we must note one essential fact. The Huns released no new social or productive energies. They did not transform the position of the peasantry, as some Germanic rulers and eventually the Eastern emperors themselves would do. Still, it may be that they played an indirect role in preserving the East at a critical moment. In all ancient societies, the concentration of land into the hands of a few was a constant danger. In the West, this process paralyzed the government and helped bring about collapse. In the East, however, the aristocracy faced counterbalance from wealthy merchants and craftsmen. The Hun Empire, together with the policy of Theodosius and Chrysaphius, seems to have strengthened this commercial class at the expense of the landowners. When the social history of the Eastern Empire is more fully explored, it may appear that the Hun ascendancy helped delay the eventual triumph of the great estates, which after many struggles did prevail in the end. Of course, the picture was not simple. The merchant of Viminatium, ruined when his city fell, had little reason to bless Theodosius, and the invasions of 441 to 443 and 447 devastated frontier trade. Yet he had prospered during the earlier decades, something that would not have been possible had Marcian, with his aggressive policies, ruled in the 400s and 30s. Despite the destruction of border towns, commerce continued, for the Huns could not survive without it. In the end, we may ask, who really benefited from the 2,100 pounds of gold paid yearly to Attila? The Huns demanded it because they intended to spend it. Inevitably, much of that wealth flowed back into the Eastern Empire through trade. The question of the impact and meaning of Hun power has been debated by historians, most notably Bury, whose conclusions have been widely accepted by others. He argued that the Hun Empire actually slowed the process of Germanic fragmentation of Rome, and he gave two main reasons. First, by conquering and controlling the Germanic peoples of Central Europe, the Huns eased pressure on the Roman frontiers for many years. Although the Huns themselves carried out devastating raids into Roman provinces both east and west, Bury believed these were no worse than what the Germans would have inflicted had they remained unchecked. After the early 5th century, Italy was virtually free from barbarian invasions coming from the Danube basin, with the exception of Attila's campaign in 452. Likewise, after the fall of the usurper John in 425, German raids into Gaul became less frequent, thanks to Hun domination of the tribes that had previously threatened the Roman frontier. Second, the Romans, especially in the west, were able to employ Hun auxiliaries in large numbers. However disruptive they may have been socially, these warriors were, as Bury put it, an invaluable asset in battles against Visigoths, Burgundians, and other German enemies. In this respect, Bury's view aligns with earlier conclusions. The Huns did not accelerate Rome's collapse, but in some ways delayed it. Yet this argument needs adjustment. While it is true that Attila held the Germans in check during his lifetime, the same cannot be said of the years before his rise or after his death. Without the Huns, it is unlikely that Europe would have experienced the two massive upheavals that reshaped the continent around 376 and 405. These two moments mark turning points in Rome's decline. When the Goths crossed the Danube and shattered a Roman army at Adrianople, and when the Vandals, Alans, and Sueves broke across the Rhine, the empire was transformed into something utterly different from the age of Julian just a few decades earlier. Both invasions were triggered by the westward drive of the Huns, which forced the Germans deeper and faster into Gaul, Spain, and eventually Africa than would otherwise have been possible. Consider the case of Alaric. Without the Huns pushing from behind, he might have been able to establish his followers in the fertile lands north of the Danube. Instead, driven by desperation and unable to retreat, he wandered restlessly, half an ally and half an enemy of Rome, always seeking secure farmland for his people. His dramatic sack of Rome in 410 has captured the imagination of history, but his career was really a story of being trapped without options. Similarly, after Attila's death, the Ostrogoths were left destitute by their long subjugation under the Huns. Starvation forced them to demand land and payments from the Romans. Had they been left to prosper in their original territories north of the Danube and in southern Russia, they might have maintained a stable existence for generations, dominating the peoples who once belonged to Ermanaric's empire. Thus, while Hun dominance may have slowed German expansion between about 430 and 455, it had the opposite effect both before and after. Without the Huns, there would not have been a Visigothic kingdom in Gaul, an Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, or a Vandal kingdom in Africa so early in history. These states would no doubt have emerged eventually, but their appearance would have been delayed. The Huns held sway in Europe for less than a century, but in that short time, their impact was profound. Their influence on Western development was undeniable, and they may even have affected the East more than we realize. Yet all their effects were indirect, the result of driving other peoples into Roman lands and shaping patterns of trade. They contributed nothing directly to European progress. Unlike the Germans, Persians, or Arabs, they offered no cultural or institutional legacy. They were plunderers and raiders. One observer summed up their role with brutal clarity. Scorning agriculture themselves, they seized the food supplies of the Goths like wolves, reducing them to the condition of slaves, laboring to feed their Hun overlords.